This is Fit to Succeed in partnership with NordicFitnessEducation.com with host Ben Pratt.
Eating during the night, you see a markedly worse response in terms of how they metabolize carbohydrate and how they metabolize fat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fit to Succeed show. I'm Ben Pratt, your host, and today I'm excited to welcome back to the podcast a guest that we had on way back in episode 6. Danny Lennon is the founder of Sigma Nutrition. He has a master's degree in Nutritional Sciences from Cork University. Danny, it's great to have a fellow podcaster on the show once again.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me back. I'm excited to talk through some of this stuff today.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. Now, I particularly wanted to bring you back onto the show because you have been waxing lyrical online about a subject which I think you're very passionate about that really dials into things that we like to talk about, and that is the subject of chrono-nutrition or meal timing. We'll get into this in a little bit more depth, but just to help people get their heads around what it is we're after, I wonder if you had just 1 minute, Danny, to be able to explain to somebody why meal timings could affect their health and performance. What key things would you say to them?
So I guess the kind of 1 minute version would be that we have evidence to suggest that when you eat a meal over the course of a day can impact how you metabolize that meal. So the same meal eaten in the morning versus in the middle of the night has a very different response. And that response could be in relation to something like blood glucose, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. So how high your blood sugar goes and stays after that exact same meal will differ depending on the time of day you eat it. We also have some evidence looking at where you distribute most of your calories. So for the same number of calories across the day, where they are placed may have a role on some of these aspects of metabolic health. So I would say that's the general premise that we're looking at of not only what times we have a specific meal, but then our overall diet, where that is placed and distributed across the day can have potentially impacts on metabolic health. And there's suggestions that can tie into body composition, which I'm sure we'll come to, but primarily metabolic health is where we would start that conversation.
All right, excellent. That's a great start. And when you're saying metabolic health, maybe just to dial very slightly into that at this point, are we talking just obesity, or are you also talking about diabetes, blood glucose, or any other factors?
Yeah, so most of the markers that are looked at that will relate to the research we're going to look at will be things like fasting glucose, fasting insulin, 24-hour glucose or blood sugar across the day. You could look at other markers related to glycemic control. So like hemoglobin A1C is typically like a 3-month marker of your blood glucose, or kind of tracks with it, for example. But essentially there's these outside of it, so when we start metabolic health, we would look at things that relate to glycemic control, like I've just mentioned there. You could also look at the levels of free fatty acids in the bloodstream. You looking at how effectively you can metabolize meals and so on. So they would be some of the markers that we'll probably discuss.
Great stuff. Yeah, we're definitely going to get into some of that detail as we go through today's conversation. But perhaps we should just back off just a touch and let's begin by trying to define the term chrononutrition. And I wonder, once you do that, what branch of science has that actually come from? Did it come from the nutrition field, or did it come out of the chronobiology field?
Yeah, so I think probably a good start point is when we talk about that term chronobiology, we're looking at essentially phenomena that relate to some sort of cyclical pattern or cycles that various different biological processes go within. And there's many examples of these different types of cycles, and we'll mention a few. But for example, we have patterns within biology that repeat on a long time scale.
Mm-hmm.
So a simple example for people would be like the menstrual cycle. This repeats at approximately the same time period over and over again, but over, let's say, approximately 28 days, but it could be longer or shorter, of course, but roughly that time period. And so that is a cyclical kind of process. We then have things on a very short time scale. So if you take, when you go to sleep each night, people probably would have heard that that's broken up into distinct sleep cycles. And you could say roughly maybe 90 minutes for a sleep cycle. And that cycle will repeat over and over again. And the same, we have many other processes that run in these cycles. Now, within the body, and what we're typically talking about in relation to chrononutrition, we're focusing from chronobiology on kind of a subunit of that would be circadian biology. And I'm sure this is a topic that you would have covered if you've talked about sleep and circadian rhythms before, that a circadian rhythm is, just like we mentioned before, these rhythms that have whether that's a menstrual cycle or a sleep cycle, that's a rhythm that repeats. A circadian rhythm is one that has a time period of about 24 hours. So it's this endogenously produced rhythm of a certain process that runs every about 24 hours. And we can, so that an important element for something to be circadian in nature is that this is dictated by within the body itself. So we have these clocks that can set that rhythm to about 24 hours, although it's not exactly 24 hours. So to line that up with our 24-hour solar day, we can rely on cues from our environment to fine tune that to match up a bit more effectively. And we'll come to that. So this is the kind of idea of circadian rhythms and circadian biology. And so this is a whole area related to our health that is, you can either think of chronobiology, you can think of circadian biology. So chrononutrition is simply a field that started to emerge of saying, does when we eat or how we eat influence these circadian rhythms and therefore our health? And the idea behind this is that, as I mentioned, these circadian rhythms are mainly dictated by what we call our central circadian clock, or our master clock, which is located in the brain up near the hypothalamus. We have something called the SCN.
We're talking about internal sort of theoretical clocks, not the actual clock, just for the benefit of the listener.
Right. Yes. So this is an internal clock. So what we mean by clock is essentially it's a bunch of like 20 to 30,000 neuronal cells. So this master clock we call the SCN. And what that does, that regulates or entrains or sets these circadian rhythms. That's the main thing that sets them. Now, like we said, we can use our external environment to fine tune that more accurately. The main thing that does this is, of course, light. So if we want a rhythm to repeat over a course of 24 hours, and let's say it's a hormone like melatonin. So melatonin, people may have heard of, that you should be staying relatively low throughout the day. And then in the evening time pre-sleep, we start to see it increase upwards. And that's part of the, one of its roles is playing a part role in getting us towards sleep. Now, in order for that rhythm to remain intact, in other words, for it to be low when we want it to and to increase when we want it to, we use that feedback from the environment of when it's daytime and when it's nighttime. So we obviously mainly do that through light exposure, which is, again, of a side note, I'm sure some of your listeners will have heard people say, when you're at bed at night, don't be looking at screens with lots of blue light or having lots of bright light, for that same reason, that disrupts your melatonin increase. So we have this external cue that it helps set these circadian rhythms, but light and dark is not the only cue we have. We can also have others, and one of those being feeding potentially. Now, at this point, it's important to note that we don't just have this one central circadian clock. We actually have circadian clocks located in tissues all around the body. And so we call these peripheral clocks. And they are under the control of this central clock, but they can also be set or entrained by other factors. And we're seeing that one of them can potentially be nutrients. So when we eat certain food, if that's giving a signal to these peripheral clocks about when they set these certain rhythms of various different biological processes, then the kind of deduction from that as well, maybe we should be eating at certain times and not eating at certain times if we want to keep these clocks in synchronization. So if we want that central clock and these peripheral clocks in sync or aligned, it might be better to eat at certain times or avoiding at certain times. And this is where this kind of thought process behind chrono-nutrition actually centers. So to kind of pull that back and kind of summarize, chrono-nutrition is simply an area of research looking at when and how we eat, how does that influence the entrainment of certain circadian clocks
Mhm.
and these circadian rhythms, and therefore our health from that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's interesting the way you've kind of explained that the way we eat and the time we eat could affect the 24-hour rhythms of our body, and potentially the other way. The 24-hour rhythms of our body could also affect the way in which we feel to eat if those things are out of sync as well. And I know there's research on
Right.
both sides, which is fascinating.
Mm.
I wondered perhaps to try and help for the listener to make this feel more realistic or less scientific, we could just boil it down to a few maybe initial nutritional things that we hear that may have a bearing on chrononutrition. For example, we often hear the statement that you should get up and start your day with a nice big breakfast, and that's the most important meal of the day. Is there any bearing on that with regards to chrononutrition? Any truth or any concerns with that statement?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one because I think typically that is a common soundbite people will have heard.
Hmm.
Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, eat something as soon as you get up, etc. And I think quite rightly there's been a lot of pushback against that idea. And so a lot of the reasons people gave for breakfast being important don't actually play out. So some of the reasons people would give is, oh, this helps kickstart your metabolism, or this revs up your metabolism for the day, or you need to have glucose coming in to power your brain in the morning. All these types of things that really aren't necessarily true. And so I don't think evidence currently supports the idea you need to eat breakfast relatively soon after waking.
Hmm.
What the chrononutrition literature seems to suggest, though, is that there could potentially be benefits for, number one, skewing more of your energy intake to earlier in the day. So by that, what I mean is if you take that you eat X amount of calories across the day, if a large majority of them are very late in the day, there could potentially be benefits for partitioning more of those to earlier in the day.
Right, I
And I'm
see.
sure we'll come to this a bit later on. But the question is, well, how much earlier and how much do we have to push there? And we don't really have an answer. So I think on a very practical level, what I would say to people is, even if we were going along the lines of theoretically from a circadian perspective, having something to eat in the early part of the day may be beneficial,
Mhm.
and therefore having a bit more of your calories earlier as opposed to all late. I still don't think that tells us anything about you must eat breakfast relatively soon after waking. In fact, I just think it means the early part of the day. You can even think of the early half of the day
Mhm.
consuming something. And so I don't currently believe that the idea that you must eat breakfast is actually one that is built on that sound evidence. Now, from a practical level, is there benefits to certain people starting the day with a certain type of breakfast? I think there is, and we can definitely get into the practical side of that. But to be technically accurate, I don't think it's something that people feel they need to eat as
Mhm.
soon as they wake up, need to have a breakfast. So
Okay.
that would
Yeah,
be my
yeah.
current position.
I think that's great. And whilst before we jump to what you could eat for a breakfast, which I think maybe macronutrient variation, there could be some discussion there. Why don't we just stick with the timing first? Because in my experience as a health and fitness trainer, I found very often many people do not eat breakfast, as you suggested. Uh, Perhaps the main thing they would have early is a coffee just to stimulate themselves and wake themselves up. And they may not be eating till 11 a.m. or maybe even until lunchtime when they have their first proper food, which, as you suggest, tends to push more of their total calorie intake for the day into the later part of the day, where it might not be eating until their main meal till the evening. What considerations uh, do we need to think about from a health perspective? You kind of implied there may not always be beneficial. What concerns or considerations do we need to put into place here that the science is telling us?
Sure. And I should probably say, just purely from an anecdotal standpoint, that tends to be what most of my days and look like.
Mhm.
That first meal ingestion probably is actually around 11 a.m. And before that will just be some coffee. And another interesting side note, it does seem that ingestion of coffee can actually play a role in being a signal to some of those circadian clocks as
Correct.
well, that there's essentially a noticing that we're metabolizing some sort of nutrient, but that's a
Okay.
kind of a smaller side issue. I think to kind of go with your question of what are the considerations for people who are pushing a lot of their intake later in the day, there's a couple of theoretical things we can talk about, and then we can look at some observational data.
Mm-hmm.
But one of them would be that we know, for example, there is a circadian rhythm to insulin sensitivity. So you start out the day at your most insulin sensitive, and then throughout the day you lose insulin sensitivity, or you become a bit more insulin resistant
Mm-hmm.
as the day progresses. Now, that would, again, from a theoretical standpoint, mean, well, you probably don't want to have large amounts of your carbohydrate intake very late in the evening, because that's the point that you are going to be likely more insulin resistant. And again, this is probably depends on what type of individual we're talking about. Are they, what is their kind of body composition? What is their level of activity? What training or exercise that they've done maybe that day? And we can explore all those. But from a general perspective, we might therefore say, well, maybe you want to skew more of those calories early in the day. The same thing tends to go that it's quite clear from most of the chrono-nutrition literature that particularly during biological night, so let's say after the time where melatonin has increased a certain amount, and particularly around the time where we would hope that someone would be asleep in an ideal world, that metabolism of both carbohydrate and fat gets worse. So a lot of this would look at people that are doing shift work, for example. So we could then kind of work back and say, maybe rather than having a massive meal just before bed, if someone can push more of those calories earlier, then great. So in terms of the timing of the first, sorry, please.
I was just going to ask you, I wonder if you could clarify something, which I think maybe certainly come to my mind, maybe the listeners are thinking here. So you said there at night, so if you're eating late into the night or if you're in a night shift, that the metabolizing of fat and carbohydrates gets worse. What do we actually mean by that? Do we mean that more of the calories are being partitioned into storage? Do we mean that we're not utilizing it as energy in that given state? I mean, what do you actually mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So we have good data showing that if we took the same meal and had that during the day versus had that same meal during the night, what you would see, when I mean by glucose metabolism being worse, you would see someone's blood sugar level go higher and stay higher for longer when they had that meal during the nighttime. Right. So you're getting this, what we call a glucose excursion. You get a greater increase and prolonged increase in your blood sugar following that meal, depending on what time of day you had it. And the same thing with fat metabolism means that you have this differences in the amount of free fatty acids that stay within the bloodstream. So it's essentially how we metabolize and use the nutrients within that meal afterwards. So that's kind of mainly what we're getting at. Now, how much of a problem that is for someone is another discussion that we could definitely have. And there's still a lot of questions around that. But that is typically what I'm referring to by a worse carbohydrate metabolism, is essentially that you get these worse glucose excursions.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate that. While we're on the subject of shift work, I wonder if we could just tag on another thought there, because if someone is working shift work, like you know, especially the night shift, they're likely to be working all night long, perhaps going to bed at 6 a.m. And the time that they would break their fast would probably be in the early afternoon. Is there anything to consider at that point with regards to when or what they should do to break a fast in the afternoon, rather than how we would typically think about it as earlier in the morning?
So shift work is probably the most difficult case to deal with for many reasons. I mean, just from a general health standpoint, we know there are lots of challenges with people who are doing shift work. And that can depend on the timing of that shift, of course, whether it's stable or whether they're changing back and forth between day and night shifts, etc. But in general, you're getting a lot of circadian disruption just from doing that shift work. In relation to nutrient intake, there again hasn't been a lot of direct studies looking at like specific protocols that we know, like what is best or how should a shift worker eat. But there are some things that we could maybe piece together that, at least to me, mechanistically make sense. So I think the first one would be, when we're thinking about where they put most of their food intake on, let's say, the days that they're doing night shifts, it would make most sense to me to try and avoid having the bulk of that food intake in what we can refer to as the danger zone. And I hate referring it to that as that, but essentially the time where we know carbon fat metabolism is at its worst, which is right in that time frame from, let's say, anywhere between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., let's say. In there, that's where we know that you get these really poor or probably the worst metabolism of that meal during that time. So avoiding large meals, particularly that are very high in calories, carbohydrate, and or fat during those times might be a good idea. So you would push them outwards towards either before the start of the shift, maybe to after the shift, essentially trying to leave as little of the day's calories within that time point. And so that might mean someone is consuming, like, let's say a good sized meal before, just towards the start of their shift. And then maybe even afterwards when they come home if they wish. And then that time in the middle, if they are going to have something, maybe snacking on high protein foods, because what it does seem, and this kind of comes from some of the sports nutrition literature, that you don't seem to see the same problems with protein digestion during the night, that we seem to be able to digest that kind of quite completely. And so that's actually a hypothesis that I think some groups are actually going to look at now of, can we do that, of using high protein feeding during that nighttime period in order to get better outcomes. So that might be suggestive that could be an idea. So what that would mean is, for the person in your case, that hypothetical case of someone that's doing a night shift, they get up in the afternoon. Yeah, I would start with maybe having a fairly decent sized meal at that point. They maybe can do the same in the evening before they go into work. And then during that time of actually during the night, if they are going to be consuming something, ideally a high protein snack. Now, this is all from a position of knowing it's much easier said than done, and knowing people who work within healthcare, for example, and the crazy amount of work they have to do, the length of their shifts, that they're already going to be super tired going into that, and that they have very little time to even have a minute to themselves, never mind worry about what they're going to be consuming. All of that together makes it very difficult to say, hey, yeah, just have a protein shake instead of having an actual meal. So I realize the practical challenges, but I think if someone would say theoretically what might be a good way to set up my diet, that could be one way. And I've seen other people suggest something similar of, if you take the period between, let's say, midnight and 5 a.m., have that as a fasting window, and then eat outside of those, even on your night shifts. That could potentially make some sense, again, for the time point where we see the worst digestion of certain meals.
Yeah, I mean, that I totally get what you're saying with regards to the impact of energy and fatigue during a night shift. It's quite likely that somebody's going to feel tired and they're going to be after something that has high energy rather than something like protein that's going to be a slow burn in terms of metabolic effect. But I also take on your point there. I was about to ask, actually, and you mentioned it, this idea of fasting and whether an intermittent style fasting approach in relation to chronobiology follows some of the sense in terms of scientific literature, not eating straight away in the morning perhaps, but keeping your calories within a certain window so that you don't end up eating too late.
Yeah, so if we take outside of shift work and just take of people that are on a normal kind of setting, one of the areas that we have a lot of research and actually a lot of interest right now is the area of time restricted feeding, which is essentially what you alluded to, Ben, of that having your food intake within a certain window of time. And it's as simple as that. So people might think of that the same way as a daily intermittent fasting protocol that they've seen. Oh, I start eating at 12 and I stop eating at 7 or whatever it is. The idea with time restricted feeding is that is a protocol that specifically came from the kind of chronobiology, chrono-nutrition area, in that it's built on the idea of we're trying to match up someone's food intake with daylight, essentially, right? That we're kind of squeezing it in, that we're not eating calories probably late into the day, and we're having a shorter feeding window. And so when we look at the different types of research on this right now, we have some that would compare it to someone's habitual diet. And this is where you see some really interesting stuff from a practical sense, that just getting people to restrict their feeding window with no other instruction about diet seems to give benefits in terms of, you see reduction in body weight typically, and that is driven by reduction in overall caloric intake. And then there's some benefits for those metabolic markers I mentioned earlier, like blood glucose, insulin, and so on. they all tend to improve. And interestingly, they seem to improve even before weight loss has occurred. So there's benefits compared from someone's habitual diet to just restricting that feeding window. And the reason why I think that's interesting, even though it's not really well controlled in some of these trials, like some of them are just pilot trials, but the reason why that's really interesting is because of the ability for that to be scaled out and to be used by people without needing to have very detailed either education around nutrition, a very detailed protocol about what foods to consume or not, having to change their complete preferences for food or the cultural aspects of their food. It's simply, you can stay doing what you're currently doing, but let's try and squeeze that within this certain window. And that seems to have some of these benefits. So the next question then from there people typically have is, how long should this feeding window be?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Should I place it? And they are more difficult to work out. So most commonly within research, you see that that feeding window is anywhere from 8 to 12 hours typically. And you see, regardless of what it actually is, has a benefit over their baseline or habitual diet. So some of the research suggests that most people in the general population actually have a normal feeding window of anywhere between 15 to 16 hours, which essentially means that from when they wake up in the morning, they're consuming something relatively soon, all the way until having their final nutrient consumption relatively close to bed. And so just squeezing that in or having a shorter feeding window, getting that from 15 down to 12 seems to have benefits. What we're still trying to work out is how much more of a benefit, if any, do you get from moving that from 12 to 10 or down to 8, or is 9 better than 11, or so on. So there's all these different combinations that we could look at that we don't really know which one is better per se. And there's some reasons I'll get to for that. But it seems that over having no feeding window, for the average person in the general population, there is probably some benefit to putting some fixed feeding window for those reasons, in terms of controlling overall intake, and then some of the metabolic health benefits too. And I think some of that would obviously relate to the fact that you're probably not having a meal relatively close to bed, which I probably think is probably not the best idea from some of that standpoint. Of having a meal close to bed, I would leave a couple of hours at least in an ideal world.
I'd love to pick up on that actually, because in the sleep literature there is some science around indicating that if you have a higher carbohydrate intake closer to bedtime, that can help stimulate melatonin and therefore help with sleep onset. And there's also the other theory, which you might be able to address, is that if somebody's blood sugar needs to be stabilized late in the night, if they have a meal closer to bedtime, it might help with stability of blood sugar as they rest. Is there truth to that? Is there problems with that? What do you think?
Yeah, I've seen both of those points made. And I think this is where we have to try and take a step back and take these areas that I've looked at different things specifically and say, well, how do they kind of fit together? Because if we're looking at this purely from a circadian rhythm perspective, we end up in this position of, oh yeah, we don't want to have carbs later in the evening because we're less insulin sensitive. We want to have more of our calories early in the day, et cetera, et cetera. But then, like you say, for someone who maybe finds a benefit to consuming a relatively high carb meal in the evening, and that relates to them allowing them to get better sleep, is their health going to be better for that? Yeah, you can make a case there too. So I think it's trying to, number one, fill this all together. Number two is trying to work out why are we seeing some of these results. So I would be of, I wouldn't rule out that someone can see a benefit doing that, but I think that if someone were to have a shortened feeding window, have consistent meal times day to day and consistent sleep and wake times day to day, I think that would probably allow them to be able to have proper sleep onset, unless there's obviously some sort of other clinical issue going on. But in general, I think that would help a lot of people, just the consistency of the timing of it. But yeah, I don't dispute that certain people may find a benefit to consuming some carbohydrates in the evening. And there's, in some of the pieces that I've written, try and make it clear that there are several caveats to this idea of large meals in the evening or carbohydrates at nighttime, where you actually could fit those things in, or it would be contraindicated not to do so. So there are definitely exceptions, but overall, I would, from a circadian perspective, it still doesn't change the fact that we would probably not want to have large amounts of food just before bed.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally would agree with that, to be honest. And then sitting and trying to sleep with a belly full of food that's trying to digest probably isn't the best either. There is one other thought, though, that I think links into this idea of maybe eating later. And that is in our modern world, a lot of people, because of their timing, have no choice but to eat later. They have to work. They probably train after work. And then by the time they've wrapped that all up and then they're heading home, they're probably not eating their meal till 8:30 or 9 o'clock. So it's already getting quite late in their day. And there is some benefit, even in a chronobiology perspective for training late, because peak body temperature tends to be late afternoon, early evening. And so that means their performances might be better at that time of day. And then sports nutrition says, well, you should eat before and after your workout. So potentially that pushes more calories into that later point of the day, maybe out of convenience. You have any thoughts on that with regards to chrononutrition?
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is where those kind of caveats that I mentioned come in. That one of them that I mentioned is people who are athletes, and particularly for people who are doing training in that evening period. So there's two things that happen here. One is just on a general point about athletes and nutrition, that if their priority with their nutrition is around performance and recovery, then we should align with the sports nutrition principles that we know will maximize those things.
Right.
And if that is consuming protein and carbohydrate after a specific training session so that you're ready for the next day's training and that you recover properly, then again, that's the priority. So for any athlete where performance and recovery is their priority, that's the main reason why they're eating in a certain way, then again, that prioritizes over everything else. I think the other thing that changes is even for people who are not worried so much about high-end athletic performance, but who are still regular exercisers or go to the gym in the evening time, one of the beneficial things that does is, as I've mentioned a couple of times, we have this decline in insulin sensitivity across the day. So it's lowest in the evening time. And therefore, we might expect a higher increase in blood glucose and this larger glucose excursion from a late evening carbohydrate-based meal. But if we've done some training in the hours beforehand, particularly people who are doing, let's say, some resistance training, one of the cool things that happens is we get the movement of a certain glucose transporter, GLUT4, from the inside a muscle cell to the surface of the cell. And what this transporter does allows us to move that glucose or that sugar from the bloodstream into that muscle cell. But importantly, allows that to happen without requiring the action of insulin, which is usually required. That's usually how we move glucose from the bloodstream into a certain cell, that insulin mediates that process. This, in response to this, what we call GLUT4 translocation that happens after, let's say, lifting some weights or doing some sort of exercise with some muscle contraction, is that it now allows us to move that glucose into the muscle cell quite readily without requiring insulin to be really involved in that process. So that means that we can still get proper glucose disposal regardless of how insulin resistant those muscle cells may be at that time point. So it kind of mitigates any of those problems that would come purely from the glucose insulin perspective. And then, like I said, more generally, if we're talking about athletes, they're going to kind of tick the box for a lot of other things, like they're generally going to be leaner, generally going to be more insulin sensitive, generally going to be healthier, et cetera, that are all beneficial, that may outweigh the slight benefit we would get to skewing more to intake early in the day. Right. Whereas if we take someone in the general population who doesn't have all those things, and let's say has high fasting blood glucose, is insulin resistant, who is not doing that much exercise, the impact of them having a large meal in the evening is probably going to be more problematic. Or the benefit they would get from changing that kind of timing and distribution of their intake may be more important than that person who is an athlete. So I think they're all very real considerations that I would completely take on board for sure.
I really like the way that you put that. And one of the ways that I kind of view that is this idea that we have to match the nutritional needs to the internal metabolic environment of the individual. And like you said there, an athlete is more likely to be able to metabolize higher carbohydrate, higher calories, higher fat than is somebody who's sedentary and highly stressed in the first place. And so chrononutrition is
Mhm.
probably going to have much more bearing on that sedentary individual than potentially the athlete who already is heightened in their performance in lots of internal mechanisms.
Yeah, and that's it. I mean, there's so many different things we can do day to day that can influence our health to some degree,
Mm,
and none of us do all of them all of the time perfectly, right? We
mm,
accept that there's certain things that we do that there's a trade-off, that hey, this thing that I'm going to do isn't on paper the best, but I get some benefit for what I want from life. And so it's not about trying to do everything. It's trying to pick and choose what are things are going to be most useful that can fit in to our other goals.
mm.
And so whilst you could say, yeah, maybe on paper you don't want to eat right before bed, I'm still never going to tell an athlete, hey, when you come home, don't have protein because we just finished training. That would
Mm.
be a terrible idea, because that doesn't fit in what allows them to get the most that they can from life. And in general, it's not even going to have any detrimental impact that we can really point to. So I think, yeah, understanding the context of where we're giving these recommendations is really important.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think as well as another clarification that is really key here is this idea of we're talking about chronic, consistent poor patterns of eating, not just a one-off here or
Yes.
there. And in many cases, the athlete's probably eating well most of the time, but on game day or something like that, he's unable to do so because he has to adjust to the game. And that brings me to
Mm,
another
absolutely.
thought, which is that it's reported quite common in the science that people's eating patterns are rarely scheduled at the same time. They're usually quite erratic. People generally just eat when it's convenient to their life rather than trying to schedule things in a very rigid manner. And when we look at this idea of chrononutrition, this idea of trying to map to a scheduled biological rhythm, that if those rhythms are working nicely, we should map our nutrition to that. Should we be quite rigid with regards to that, or is there scope for leeway?
Yeah, I actually think that's one of the more important aspects that's actually probably less controversial than others, that having a relatively consistent mealtime day to day can have benefits in a very similar way to, I'm sure that you've discussed on the podcast before, about regular sleep and wake times,
Mm-hmm.
that if they are changing all over the place, even if it's 8 hours per sleep episode, if the sleep and wake time is changing dramatically, that's not the exact same as getting that same 8 hours every day, but at the same bedtime and wake time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same thing we can think of with nutrition, that one of the kind of colloquial terms that was used in some of the research was this idea of metabolic jet lag, which is a kind of an add-on to the idea of social jet lag. So social jet lag being that if you change your sleep and wake times on a certain day, and the most common would be for people who, let's say, work Monday to Friday, maybe like a 9 to 5 job, and they have a certain wake time that's relatively early and relatively early bedtime for those 5 days, but the weekend comes around and you typically get this shift of a lying in to later in the day on Saturday and Sunday, as you'd expect, and a later bedtime on Friday and Saturday night, because again, you don't have to be up for work. So you get this kind of couple of hour shift that is essentially causing what we call a circadian phase shift.
Mm-hmm.
And what that would kind of mirror is, to some degree, you also get a circadian phase shift when you cross time zones, which is why we get these symptoms of jet lag.
Mm-hmm.
Hence why we get this term social jet lag. Now, the term metabolic jet lag, as it was used in I think a paper by Gill and Panda, was around the idea of, you see the same change in people's habitual meal times, particularly of breakfast, but also their last meal of the day, from when you compare weekdays to the weekend.
Right.
So people, when they get to the weekend, again, because they're waking up later, their first meal of the day ends up being later, and also they will eat larger meals, or their final meal, later in the day. And this kind of makes sense to most people who think about how they eat and wake up and sleep from weekend to during the week, if they have a typical Monday to Friday job. And so what this can be, again, doing is causing this circadian phase shift. So this would give some credence to the idea that it's probably, rather than having a very rigid exact time, I would say as close as is practically possible to the timings of meals from day to day is probably going to be beneficial. And you certainly don't want to really erratic from day to day. So from one day to the next, changing the times of those meals, how many meals there's going to be, is probably at least on paper, not going to be as beneficial as having some sort of degree of structure. Now, how much of an impact is hard to know as well. And then also, of course, we got to take into account the practicalities of it. But in all else considered, I think a consistent meal timing day to day is probably better than erratic one.
Sure, I appreciate that. Now, I know that the science probably won't be this exact, but I wonder, just in your opinion, when you're talking about trying to keep your meals relatively close to the same times all week long, are we talking like something like within the hour of when you would normally eat, or are we being tighter or a bit more relaxed than that?
Yeah, I don't know if I have actually a good answer to this of how to quantify what that is, or even enough confidence to be able to suggest a number to people. So that's why I tend to go with as close as is practically possible.
Okay.
So if it doesn't prevent you from hitting all the other fundamental aspects of nutrition, like your overall intake, your overall quality of food, etc., then having it at the exact time is great. But if it's within, like an hour of that, I think that's probably I would classify that still as consistently the same time.
Great.
Once it starts getting to like 3 hours, say, of a difference, then we're starting to see, okay, that's a markedly different time that you're consuming that. Like if your final meal is at 7 p.m. versus 10 p.m., I think that's a significant difference. If it's 6:30 or 7:30, probably no real difference there that we could detect. So I think something around that makes sense to me, but I'm unaware of anything that's quantified the specific timing. Yeah.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Now, I'd like to address one last topic. It's kind of probably a potentially big one. When you were on the show way back in episode 6, we talked quite a lot around scientific strategies for weight loss. And at that time, it perhaps hadn't delved into the chrononutrition the way that you have now. So I'd love to just add on to that a little bit now. And we often hear, and we talked about back then, that the primary weight loss principle that underpins a lot of what people achieve is calorie restriction. And I just wonder, is now with this extra research and that you've looked into on chrononutrition, is there any other factors to consider with regards to weight loss and optimizing that process that may be beyond just the calorie restriction thought process?
So this is, I'm really glad you bring up this question, because this is where sometimes there's some confusion when people first starting hearing how chrononutrition not only can affect some of those metabolic parameters we mentioned, but also it seems to suggest it can impact our energy expenditure, or how many calories we're using over the day. That needs to still be replicated a bit more, but at least there's a hypothesis behind that. But what I want to be super clear on is that none of that changes the fundamental basis of energy balance and how that relates to changes in body composition over time, i.e. if someone wants to lose body fat, that there needs to be a net caloric deficit in place. That doesn't change. So that is still the kind of fundamental thing, that no matter what strategy someone uses to induce loss of body fat, by whatever means that's going to be, there has to be a calorie deficit present. So there has to be more expenditure than intake. If chrononutrition were to play a role, it would still fit within that. So it would have to be doing something that changes energy expenditure relative to how much you've eaten. Now, there's some things that suggest that could play a role. So there was a couple of studies that suggest if you push more of those calories earlier in the day, then you get a higher rate of energy expenditure. And that seems to be from like just non-exercise activity, that you seem to get an increase from that. And so if that were to be replicated and play out, then yeah, you may see slight differences in the amount of body weight someone could lose for the same number of calories that they're taking in, but because it's changing their energy expenditure. So it's not breaking any of the calories in, calories out equation or the idea around energy balance. It's fitting perfectly within that. So it doesn't change that at all. The other point I would make, though, is that whilst energy balance is the most fundamental thing that relates to changing, let's say, body comp, or probably weight loss / fat loss specifically, I think for muscle gain, there's kind of a bit of different nuance. But if we look at it's never been the case that that's the only thing that matters. There's a whole host of things that play a role in what results someone likely get. The most obvious being if you just change around the macronutrient composition for the same number of calories, you'll likely see different changes in body composition. So if someone has a 0-gram protein diet, then that's probably not going to have the same impact on their body composition as one that has 150 grams a day, even if those calories are the same. And again, that's a ludicrous example, but just to show that it's not just calories, and that's not what the energy balance equation says. All we're saying when we talk about a calorie deficit being present is that in order for fat loss to occur, there needs to be a calorie deficit, but a whole host of other factors still matter. So your macronutrients still matter. I would say your food quality still matters, especially for practical reasons as well as health reasons. And there's certain ways that you can set up your diet that makes it more likely you can actually stick to that calorie deficit. And that's where I think some of the chrono-nutrition stuff can play a role. For example, with the time-restricted feeding we mentioned, we know that just getting people to restrict their feeding window without tracking calories, people end up consuming less. And therefore, that's why they're seeing weight loss occur. So yes, is an alternative strategy, but the reason it's working is still because a calorie deficit is being induced, but it might just make it easier for people to do when you have this restricted feeding window. So hopefully that kind of clarifies that if there were to be a benefit, still fitting within that paradigm as opposed to saying energy balance is wrong.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. It's knowing the drivers that manage our energy balance, and what you're kind of getting at here with chrono-nutrition is that they're the stimulus of getting our meals maybe in a time restricted window and eating the bulk of our calories earlier in the day changes, like you said, how easy or hard it may be to be able to consume the right amount of calories to induce fat loss. And absolutely.
Yeah, and then there's kind of things we could hypothesize that we're not too sure of, but that potentially can make sense thereof. Two hypothetical situations where I'm eating the same number of calories across the day. In let's say in universe A, that's a certain distribution, and then in an alternative parallel universe, I'm eating the same number of calories. But let's say I push more of them to earlier in the day, and that ends up meaning that, let's say, my non-exercise activity increases across the day. I take more steps, I use up more energy. Or when I go and train, I have a higher quality training output and therefore expend more energy. Could that potentially happen? Yeah, maybe. Like if that were to be shown, that would be an example of a situation where changing the energy distribution changes the result in body composition, even for the same number of calories taken in, but it hasn't changed energy balance because all it's done is just change someone's energy expenditure. Right. Now, I'm not suggesting that is what is happening, but that would be an example of how those things could fit within each other, for example.
Excellent. No, I really like that. And I like that thought process. I wonder, perhaps just while we're on this topic of weight management, if we could just get really clear, because I know people would probably be thinking and asking this question, really clear on the benefits of chrono-nutrition for managing different macronutrients. We kind of implied earlier that if you shift more of your carbs and fats in earlier in the day, that may be beneficial. And you also sort of implied that proteins seem to not be necessarily massively affected by chrono-nutrition. Did I get that right? Or have you got a different perspective?
Yeah, that I would think that would be relatively consistent with what we see to date so far. If we're to pull this into the most kind of practical heuristics that I would be comfortable saying to people right now, because this is still an evolving area and we still need to work out some of this, and we're only kind of speculating on some. I think there are some relatively simple things that I think make some sense and would likely work, but we might still need to work out the mechanism as to why they're working. But there's still a lot of room to fit them in. So I think I would say with all what we said, you could simply boil it down to, for most people, there may be some benefit in terms of both their health and managing body composition to having some sort of restricted feeding window. How long exactly that is, I don't know. But let's say it's probably 12 hours or less, right? So for someone that has no feeding window, they can start at 12 hours, see if that makes any difference, how that works. They can try others, but having some degree of feeding window might help most people in the general population.
Mhm.
Again, there are some caveats where that wouldn't be applied. If you're an athlete that is struggling to eat enough food already, if you have multiple training sessions across the day and you have to fuel first thing in the morning and late at night, might not be a good idea. But for most people, for general health purposes, having a restricted feeding window might be a good idea. 2, avoiding meals during biological night, and particularly large meals that are high in carbohydrate and fat during biological night is I think relatively uncontroversial. I think then having a couple of hours at least before sleep where you're not consuming food is probably good for a couple of reasons.
Mhm.
Again, one on the chrono-nutrition side, then there's some kind of practical aspects to it as well. For example, people who struggle with acid reflux, if they have a large meal just before bed and now they're lying horizontally, probably not a good idea. So having, I would say, a couple of hours at least pre-sleep where you're not consuming food might be a good idea. And then the other one is within that window of feeding across the day, trying not to squeeze a large percentage of your calories right into that final meal. Probably distributing at least some of that a bit earlier or trying that out to see how you feel may have some benefits for certain people. And essentially thinking of it during the daytime or daylight hours is where I'm going to try and consume most of that food and skewing it some of those calories a bit earlier. And that's as much as we can like confidently kind of conclude right now. And even within that, people could make some counterpoints that I would fully agree with. But I think the reason why I use the word heuristics as opposed to hard rules is that some of these things we still need to work out. Are they really working for the reasons we think? How much of this is down to the circadian aspect? But as a general heuristic, what we know is for a lot of people in the population who would do those 3 or 4 things I just mentioned would likely see some degree of benefit. So I think they're definitely worth people picking 1 or 2 that might be able to fit in. And then the final point I would make is that none of this undercuts the fundamental aspects of nutrition that I'm sure you've probably addressed in the podcast before of overall how many calories are you consuming? What is the overall quality of your food? What is the macronutrient composition of the diet? Those things and your ability to adhere to those general principles over time are the most important. If trying to do some of this chrono-nutrition stuff makes it more difficult or stops you from being able to do those important things or disrupts your adherence, then it's probably not something you should be worrying about. So I think that would be the general current conclusions I would come to in this area.
I think that's a great summary, and I like that you kind of alluded to this fine-tuning concept that chrononutrition is not one of the big rocks necessarily, but is a fine-tuning rock that can help to improve certain things for the majority of people. And I found this to be a really fascinating discussion. Is there any other topic or element that we didn't cover that you would like to cover before we bring this to a close?
No, I think we got to most of the things that I think are important for people to be aware of. I think that kind of hopefully that kind of final summary that I gave kind of represents where I currently at from a practical sense of how we might use some of this stuff. But yeah, I think there's plenty in there for people to consider.
Now, I know you've written a considerable blog post on this on your website on Sigma Nutrition. Would you mind just letting the listeners know what they would be looking for, and then I'll link to that in the show notes if they want to find that.
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of places you can find it. So if you go to sigmanutrition.com and you just click into the articles tab, it'll be under Chrono-nutrition. But that article is actually hosted on the Stronger by Science website, so you can find it there directly as well. So
Excellent.
if you go to strongerbyscience.com and just search for their articles, the one on chrono-nutrition is mine. That one's pretty extensive and lengthy and detailed. So for people who want to nerd out on some of that stuff, they can do so. So yeah, either of those places will have the article for you.
Yeah, fantastic. And it was, well, I would say it comes highly recommended. It is a good nerd out read. Well worth the time to get your head into that. Danny, it's been such a pleasure having you on the show today and to draw upon your expertise again in this very new scientific area of chrononutrition and to get a sense of what the science is telling us now. You've done an expert job on that. Thanks very much.
I appreciate you for having me and for the kind words. So yeah, thanks for doing this, Ben.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share via social media. You can also rate the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. If you'd like to know more about us, then check out our range of online courses at www.nordicfitnesseducation.com.